This is a special edition of World News Tonight with David Muir, reporting tonight from Havana, Cuba.
Good evening tonight from Havana, Cuba, where history has just been made. President Obama touching down, Air Force One landing here in Havana. The first family is here, the First Lady and their daughters, and the Cuban people are welcoming them with open arms. As many here now ask, and as many Americans wonder back home, how far will the president go with what he says here about a communist government, about human rights, and about the freedoms of ordinary Cubans? President Obama landing here in Cuba late today, making history. Just 90 miles from the U.S., he is the first president to visit Cuba in 88 years. It comes a little more than a year after the president announced the U.S. would begin normalizing relations with Cuba, a thaw decades after the Cold War ended. When we sat down with the president the first time, we asked him if this day was coming. Will you visit Cuba in your final 2 years as president?
You know, I don't have any current plans to visit Cuba.
Not ruling it out?
Well, let's see how things evolve.
After that first interview, we brought you to Cuba, driving to find a former U.S. embassy here, stripped of its title and shut down after Fidel Castro took power. But outside the old embassy this past year, we witnessed the first signs of the thaw. You can see the heavy security behind me, the officers on the corner here. We were here as members of the U.S. delegation arrived a short time ago because there is great hope that this will soon become the U.S. embassy again. And tonight, the embassy is now open again. And on his first night here, it will be among President Obama's first stops. Hola. And tonight, the people here are waiting for the American president. Here in the heart of historic old Havana, you talk to the young families here, and you hear the same thing over and over again. It's time. I ask Yvette, she's 24, what she thinks of the president's visit.
¿Qué piensas acerca de la visita del presidente americano?
She tells us we don't know exactly what will happen here, but I hope there is something good and families can be reunited. And there was this young father, Andy, and his family. He tells us it's good that Cuba and the U.S. can now get along, and he reveals he has family he would love to visit in Louisiana. The president will make an historic speech televised to the Cuban people. And inside this merceria, a tiny store, I asked, will they be watching? And what if the president offers tough words about change that must come here?
Si las palabras son difícil para su presidente, ¿qué piensas?
Of course, she tells us she'll be listening, and we are prepared for anything the president has to say. On the streets here, scenes frozen in time. The American cars from the 1950s. When Fidel Castro took power in 1959, he shut down imports of American cars. 60,000 vintage cars still driven here. The cars, a symbol of an economy in slow motion for decades, still controlled by a communist government. And there are still arrests here, dissidents who speak out about their own government. President Obama aware of criticism from some back home that the embargo should not be lifted, and we will ask him about that while here. But already, more Americans are now visiting Cuba for cultural exchanges. Simply coming for tourism is not yet allowed. Flights from America will soon resume. There is a bidding war among airlines already. And tonight, Starwood Hotels and Resorts just announcing they will renovate and operate 3 hotels here. Will restoring relations and pushing for a more open economy actually give Cubans a new voice? As many Americans back home wait to visit as tourists again, to see the culture frozen in time in those American cars, we asked, with no American parts allowed in for decades, who fixes them and how? Mechanics who improvise. A 53 Plymouth.
Mercedes-Benz.
In that car, now a Mercedes engine. And we wondered how much of the car is original.
¿Cuántas partes en este coche son original?
He answers with a smile, just the body and the transmission. Rebuilding it all on their own. As an American president now arrives, many ask what will change here and how far will he go in private with President Castro and in public before the Cuban people. The president has already acknowledged that the embargo will likely not be lifted here in Cuba until the next president. And we'll ask him about some of the criticism back home that embargo shouldn't be lifted at all. Our exclusive interview with the president tomorrow night, right here on World News Tonight, with our first moments with the president on Good Morning America first thing in the morning, as ABC News coverage of this historic visit gets underway. We'll be back here from Cuba a little later in the broadcast with a letter that arrived here from the president even before he arrived, and the message he sent about a cup of Cuban coffee. And finally, Early tonight from Cuba, that historic visit already underway. The first images coming in, President Obama making history here. The first American president in decades to see Havana with his own eyes. We ask how much of Cuba has changed since President Calvin Coolidge was here in 1928. And tonight, the letter President Obama sent to Cuba before he even arrived. This moment, 88 years in the making, once unthinkable. The first family in Cuba tonight. Air Force One landing here in Havana. A much different arrival from 88 years ago. President Calvin Coolidge sailing into Havana on a battleship. The only other sitting U.S. president to visit here, it was 1928. A reporter writing for the New York Times back then saying his face was full of smiles. The streets then, the streets now, with Cuban and American flags. And tonight, President Obama seen smiling too. And the president sent a letter to Cuba just this past week, one of the first direct letters to arrive here in decades. The president writing to a Cuban woman who had written the president before and inviting President Obama for a coffee. The U.S.-Cuba direct stamp right there in the corner. The president writing back, hopefully I will have time to enjoy a cup of Cuban coffee.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
The hope of this visit clear on so many faces today. And even on the playgrounds here, they are aware of the history. We have not forgotten the children here, the soccer game beyond the fence.
Es una buena idea.
Robin telling me it will be great when the relations are better. Thanks to the U.S., we're going to have a better economic situation. And I asked all of them if diplomatic ties with the U.S. is a good idea.
¿Es una idea? ¿Sí o no? Sí. Sí. Todos.
The children raising their hands to the future. And that is World News Tonight from Cuba. Thank you for watching here on a Sunday night. Much more of our coverage of this historic visit tomorrow morning on Good Morning America and right here on World News Tonight, our exclusive interview with the president tomorrow night. For Tom Yamas back in New York, I'm David Muir here in Havana, Cuba. I hope to see you right back here tomorrow night.